A picture is worth 1,000 words, and I'm hoping that this video will be worth 1,000 words on this webpage. Hi, I'm Pastor Wright from Keystone Baptist Church. Thank you for taking the time to visit our website today. Unfortunately, words on a page can only do so much to give you a feel for a church. There's no substitute for actually visiting. You probably already know that. But sometimes, walking into a strange place with people you don't know is a little intimidating. That's why we've created this video. I want to give you a visual tour of what to expect when you're our guest here at church. When you arrive at the church, you can park in either the front or the back parking lot, but you'll probably end up parking in the back parking lot because there are more spaces.
All right, we're going to go get started this morning. And so welcome to the Bible and Ancient History. So before we get going on the topic for this morning, let's go and open with a word of prayer. So let's pray. Dear Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word, and we thank you that we're able to look to it and not just learn things that are important and vital for our spiritual life, Lord, but that we also can trust and know that the historical and scientific and geographical information in there is also accurate, Lord. I just ask that you would bless us here this morning, and in your Son's name, amen. All right, so welcome back. I'm excited about the topic this morning because we are kind of getting out of the difficult part of the study. The first week and a half, first lesson and a half that I had was pretty easy to figure out what we're going to talk about and everything there because we're dealing with the prerequisites. We were dealing with looking at saying we're going to believe the Bible, even if secular scientists or secular archaeologists say things that are different from that, we're going to choose to believe the Bible in the timeline that it gives us. And just going through and understand that that is where our truth comes from. That's where it's at there. And then, so that was a pretty easy part to go through. But then last week was a really hard part dealing with because we talked about a lot of things that happened before the flood and shortly after the flood. And what makes those so difficult to talk about is we don't have solid dates to figure things out. The Bible doesn't give us specific dates. It doesn't say, in the year of our Lord this happened, or, 700 BC. And, if they did, then Elijah would have been like, what's this BC mean, kind of thing. And so they wouldn't have been able to, they didn't give us that. And then secular archaeology and even Christian archaeology a lot of times is difficult to figure out dating and when things are because of just how things went. One of the hardest parts about what we're going to be going over today is dealing with the Egyptian dynasties and looking at different things there with Abraham, Moses, and Joseph, because the information that we have from the archaeological record, which, remember, even if it's not true, we have to believe, because it's the only evidence we have extra biblical or outside of the Bible, that when we look at those things and figure out what it's talking about there, with Egypt especially, a lot of times there were two different kingdoms in the early times. So their records of the kings, they would say this king ruled for this many years, and this king ruled for this many, and they would give all of the information for the different kings. Well, the problem was sometimes the kings that were in the line there were the two different kingdoms. So they were ruling at the same time, but if you look at them straight literally, then you're going to get an expanded or exaggerated time frame there. So it's difficult to figure that out. So the lesson today, again, is along those lines of the difficulty of figuring out when things happened. Next week, we will be able to get into much more concrete situations where the archaeological evidence actually mentions characters in the Bible. So then we can look and say, okay, we know that this person was alive during this individual's reign. So we're able to figure that out. But this week, looking at it says, what about world history? And so what I want to look at today is some of the first major stories in the Bible that we talk about with the families outside, or sorry, not outside, but after the flood. And so today, we're going to be looking at Abraham in world history and kind of how he introduces things into that. Now, from what I could figure out, once again, it's difficult with the dating systems and everything, looking at there and figuring out when these things actually happened. As we'll look at some of the pharaohs, even secular archaeologists, I've found 3 different dates for the same pharaoh. And they say, okay, so 3 different dates, not that big of a deal kind of thing. But those dates are sometimes decades, if not hundreds of years apart. And so if they can't agree on it and figure it out, and these are Egyptologists, like people who do this for a living, have degrees in this information, then me doing, several hours worth of Google research throughout a week, I'm not going to be able to nail it down either as well as I would like to. So just keep those things in mind as we're going through. But with Abraham, we talked about him a little bit last week. Where did he start out? What was some of the things that we first figured out about Abraham last week when we talked about him? What is the beginning of his story look like? Yes?
He was wandering around Iraq.
All right, he was wandering around modern Iraq. He was born in Ur of the Chaldees, which again is most likely in modern Iraq. Then his father moved Abraham, and was Abram at that point, and took his nephew Lot with him. It would have been his father's grandson Lot, and they went up to Hebron. And then from there we see Hebron is in modern day northern Iraq, that area there what we call the Fertile Crescent or Mesopotamia. All right, review question again. Does anybody remember what the word Mesopotamia means? Oh, yes, between the rivers. Yes, so that was a title given to that area, modern day Iraq, and between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Fertile Crescent. If you were to look at a geographical map there, you would see that from... You see, this stand is actually takes its inspiration from Marie Antoinette. So I have to be careful. Marie Antoinette got her head cut off in the French Revolution, for those who don't know the reference. So I have to be careful with this one. Every time I rip its head off, I'm like, I need to fix that. And then I forget about 30 seconds later, like I did today. So we'll see if that gets fixed this week. Looking at... What was I talking about? Oh, Ur of Chaldees, yes, the Fertile Crescent, yes, thank you. So if you look at a geographical map today, from Israel going up and around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, all the way down to the southern part of modern-day Iraq, you will see that it is green, it is very fertile there. And so that it makes sense why civilization developed there. In fact, we will look at this more next week, but every major civilization in human history, now I'm not saying like people group that settled in certain areas, but major urbanized civilizations developed around rivers. And there's two really good reasons for that. One, you need the fresh water to survive, for you to drink, for your animals, for your crops, things like that. But rivers also were the highway, were the railroads of the ancient time, really all the way up until highways and railroads were made. That rivers were how you could transport massive amounts of goods very quickly. And so it developed there. Stop that. Just going to move it over a little. There we go. It developed very easily in that area. And so, as it was going through there, then Abraham's father died when he was in Hebron, and that's when God said, get out of your father's house, leave that area, and go to a promised land that I will tell you. Go to the land I will tell you, and today we know that is modern-day Israel. And so he was going through there, but as he was traveling and doing those certain things, a famine happened in Israel. Seemed to happen quite often in that territory. And where did Abraham then have to go at that point? Where was he, where did he, not flee to, but where did he go in order to be able to survive? He went to Egypt. Now, for me, for a long time, when I was learning about Abraham as a child and even as a young adult and everything, you hear the story of Abraham. He was like, okay, take your wife and take Lot and go to the land I'll tell you to, and then later they went down to Egypt, and he meets a pharaoh, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But remember that Lot was an incredibly, incredibly wealthy man. That when he was going through, his retainers, or the people with him, he potentially had hundreds, if not thousands of people that were not necessarily directly related to, but he would have been in charge of. He would have been a chieftain of this nomadic people that were going with him. Whether, again, they were direct family members, because you had Lot and he had his people that were with him, and Lot would have had family. To a certain extent, he would have had Hagar and Ishmael, and then eventually Isaac with Sarah would have had there. But remember, the whole problem that developed between Abraham and Lot was because of the amount of herds and sheep that they had, and not that Abraham and Lot were having a problem, but the herds were so big and they were so far removed from Abraham's purview that those men began to fight between Lot and Abraham. They began to fight over those things. They began to deal with those situations that happened. And that wasn't even something that Abraham knew about. That was so far removed. Like, it was such a big organization, such a big operation, that Abraham was doing his thing over here, and he trusted his herdsmen to do the responsible thing over here. Well, eventually they split up between Lot and Abraham in the things there. But we see that he would have, again, hundreds, if not thousands of people and animals that he would have been responsible for. So that makes a little more sense, because I don't know if you ever thought about when Abraham came into Egypt, but if it's just Abraham and, his family, maybe his wife, a couple of kids, that kind of thing, Abraham showing up into Egypt, it's really weird that Pharaoh at that time would have taken notice. Because it's a story that when Abraham went into Egypt, Pharaoh heard that his wife Sarah was very attractive, and Pharaoh was like, well, she's going to be added to my harem. And so after she was added, going there, that's the story, we'll talk about it later in this. But again, it would have been weird, because, when you travel into a different state or a different country, like, you don't get approached by the ruling personnel of that country, that state, that city even, kind of thing. You go, do about your business, and then you leave. But Pharaoh would have noticed hundreds, if not thousands, of people moving into his territory, hoping to avoid this famine that was up there. So, with that, what Pharaoh did he see? Now, I need to preface this. Again, as I mentioned, there is a real difficulty with nailing down the specific dates. When we get to the Pharaoh that was dealing with Moses, I have found 4 different both secular and Christian sources that have said what Pharaoh this might have been. The Christian source, who I've gone to several times, he's one that listed all 4 of these. Now, have any of you ever seen the old Ten Commandments movie? Who's the actor? Charlton Heston. Okay, so it's a lot of the older ones, you've seen that and everything. Personally, my favorite part of that movie is when Moses is out there, Charlton Heston is out in the wilderness, and he sees the burning bush, and he goes up completely clean-shaven, but when he comes down, he has like a 30-year-old beard, like gray beard, in like a matter of minutes. And I'm just like, how? Come on, Hollywood. There's only so much. My favorite part of the movie. But not the most unbelievable part or biblically inaccurate part of the movie. And so, does anybody remember, who does Hollywood say was king or pharaoh of Egypt at that point? Does anybody remember? Ramses II is who they say it was. Most likely not the pharaoh there. Because Ramses, from what I could find, ruled around 1279 to 1213 BC. Another one, they said, was the pharaoh Neferhotep, who was around 1700 to 1740. And then Amenhotep was around the 1400s. And then King Tut came in as one of the possible kings or pharaohs that Moses worked with. And he was around the 1300s BC. That's a 500-year span of pharaohs that might have interacted with Moses. And so, if you're just going with the 3 between Amenhotep and Ramses, then that is like saying, okay, the president of the time may have been John Adams, or it might have been Obama. Like, that's the time difference there. Like, that's the difficulty. So who did Moses deal with? Well, it might have been John Adams, but at the same time, it might have been Obama. We're not really sure. And then at the same time, if you go all the way back and you use Neferhotep from the 1700s, that's like saying he might have met William the Conqueror, who conquered England, the Norman king, in 1066, but he also might have met Obama. So, again, that's more of 1,000 years difference, but that's really what we're looking at here. And that's why this is such a difficult time to do with that. But we're pretty sure we know who Abraham met. And the reason is some things here. Specifically, there is a Jewish historian that is very well known, and from what most scholars can agree upon, he did not try to embellish the truth as much. Remember the Herodotus, the Greek historian, the father of history he's often called, he had to embellish it in order to sell the stories. He was wanting them to be sold as plays and adventure stories, so he needed to make it exciting, even if it really wasn't that exciting. And so he would have expanded it and made it a little more entertaining there. From what most scholars can figure out, Josephus didn't do that. He didn't need to. He didn't need to make it exciting to sell the copies. That was his job, so he was able to do that. But He was a Jewish historian around the time of AD 70. So may have been alive a little bit when Christ was alive, but definitely was alive when the Apostle Paul was on the earth during his time there. And so he mentioned Abraham. He talked about Abraham and some of the things that he talked about there. And so Josephus actually makes this comment when he was talking about Abraham. He says, Abraham, quote, he communicated to them, meaning the Egyptians, arithmetic, and had delivered to them the science of astronomy. Before Abram came into Egypt, they were unacquainted with those parts of learning, for that science came from the Chaldeans into Egypt. And so it's an interesting thing there. It's, again, about 2,000 years ago. This isn't a Christian looking back and interpreting it and saying, well, they've got this stuff here. This is a Jewish historian from 2,000 years ago. Now, granted, he was about 1,500 to 2,500 years removed from this, things there. But I have a picture here behind me. This is some of the clay tablets that they have found in the Chaldees, specifically. On the left, that tablet there is a dictionary. It is a dictionary for the ancient Sumerians, with the Sumerian text for school children to be able to see what the words meant and how they interacted with. On the right, the white tablet at the top, that is actually a school child's tablet. Back in the olden days, that would have been the equivalent of the little slate slabs, little chalkboards that the students would have had at their desks. Today, it's notebook paper is what that would have been. At the top of it are the students' notes from class. This right here is a square that's being dissected into two different triangles, and that is the student trying to figure out the equation to find the area of a square. This is a piece of notebook paper from geometry class, is what that is, from roughly 4,000 years ago. And so the Chaldeans were brilliant mathematicians. As far as we know, actually students, I get asked this a lot, who can we blame for math class? Some of these guys, all right? It's their fault, all right? They came up with some of this stuff. So about 4,000, 4,500 years ago, it's them. And so they were figuring this out. Now, the comment from Josephus is really, really interesting, because by the time Josephus was around, the time distance between Josephus and the ancient Sumerians is the same time distance between Josephus and us today. Roughly 2,000, if not 2,500 years. The Sumerians, as a civilization, as a powerhouse and things like that, they were gone. Now, there was a historical record and things like that, but again, it was gone. So he would not have been able to seen archaeological evidence of this. He would have known of it because it was known the Sumerians were the ones that came up with it. And what's incredibly interesting is around the time period that we believe Abraham came into Egypt, we actually see a drastic change in Egyptian Egyptian agriculture. Wow, words are hard today. Architecture. There we go. Specifically dealing with the pyramids. Now, if I say Egypt, most of the time what comes to your mind first are the pyramids. And that's quintessential. The pyramids of Giza are one of the last and most fully intact wonders of the ancient world. We'll talk about this again when we get to the time in between the testaments. But Cleopatra, the woman who, depending on who you ask, either married or had a relationship with both Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. Yes, that Julius Caesar. So Cleopatra lived closer to us landing on the moon than she did to the pyramids at Giza being built. So there was about 2,500 years between Cleopatra and the pyramids at Giza being built. There was only about 1,950 years between her and the moon landing. So those things were ancient for her. And it's an incredible thing to think about there, that civilization has been there. But before we get to the pyramids, we have what's behind me here. And what they would do before they started making the pyramids, they would have these shapes. And basically, it started out as a wall, and then it would kind of go in, and it would step up and step up. Eventually, it would develop into what was called the step pyramids. The reason they made the step pyramids that way is because it was easier to do it. And also, if you can see, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but this shape here behind me is a rectangle. when you are building something, a rectangle is a much easier shape to construct than a square, especially if you're trying to make it perfect square. It wasn't until around the time period that Abraham came to Egypt that they started to develop these more step-like pyramids here that were much more square shape, and then eventually get into what we see today as the Great Pyramids of Giza. Now, the middle one there, a little bit about that one. That one has roughly 2.3 million blocks of carved stone that were made to build that pyramid. Roughly 5.5 million tons of limestone was quarried out to make it. 8,000 tons of granite and 500,000 tons of mortar were used to help make sure everything was sealed and together there. What they believe that the outside of it was actually covered in most likely a very veneer of white stone, probably shined limestone. And the reason you see the top is a little bit messed up, a little bit different from the rest, is because after it had started to deteriorate and everything, people in the area, this pyramid's been here for 500, 1,000, 1,500 years, they start taking those pieces for themselves. They also believe that the top of the pyramid was probably capped in gold that they had there. The Pyramid of Giza, the big one there, is 11 acres that it covers. To put that in perspective, if the property here that Keystone owns, from the white fence up there all the way to the power line behind the parsonage, to the fence down here on my right to Keystone Lane to my left, that is 11 acres. So the Pyramid of Giza was the size of the Keystone property. And it's just a massive undertaking. Now, what is most often told to Sunday school children concerning the Israelite slaves and the pyramids, specifically these pyramids? That they built them, that Israelite slaves were used to build them. And they get I've heard some pretty crazy stories of where they were pulling the carts of the limestone blocks and they needed to lubricate it a little bit better because it wasn't flowing properly, so they used a slave to lubricate it, and the slave did not survive, kind of thing. So some pretty drastic things. Now, the Israelites were obviously slaves in Egypt. They were used to make the specific. We know one thing that they did. They made brick because at one point, to punish them, they were said that they couldn't use straw. They had to find their own stuff and to make the brick. So we know they did that. Unfortunately, for many Sunday school teachers, for many moons, it is probably not accurate that Israelite slaves built the pyramids at Giza. For one main reason, the pyramids of Giza were either made just before or just after Abraham was there, which was roughly 300 to 400 years before they were enslaved in Egypt. Now, would have they been used on smaller projects like the ones in front of it? Possibly. But it is very unlikely that Israelite slaves were used to make this. Also, because such a huge undertaking, we have the archaeological record of how the entire population of Egypt was commissioned to do this. Similar to how Solomon did it when he was building the temple and then building his palace, where every quarter of a year the men would be required to come and live in barracks and build the temple and build the palace and everything. They did the same thing in Egypt for this here. And so to take place there. So again, most likely it was not the Israelites that made these pyramids here, but they may have been involved in that. So what Pharaoh did Moses meet? Most likely and potentially, the argument could be made, was the Pharaoh that created these giant pyramids here. Was the pyramid, wow. I got some Dayquil running through me right now. So, the pyramids made by the Pharaoh Khufu is most likely who he met. Now, there is, again, some discrepancy there. It may have been shortly after Abraham came there, but the people that built these pyramids, or at least started to commission these pyramids, would have known about Abraham, especially if what Josephus said is accurate, that he was the one that brought this new idea of geometry and arithmetic coming to them. Also, the science of astronomy, because the pyramids are laid in such a way that astronomic situations with the different equinox are there. There was also I'm going to go back to this one here. there was a man who was Sir Leonard Woolley, was one of the great archaeologists of his time during the early 1900s, from 1922 to 1934. He wrote this about the Sumerians. He said, after grammar, and that's dealing with the dictionary there, after grammar came mathematics, and we find tables of multiplication and division, tables for the extraction of squares and cubed roots, an exercise in applied geometry. For instance, how to calculate the area of a plot of ground of a regular shape by squaring it off so that the total of the complete squares included in it, added to that of the right angled triangles, which filled in its contours, give an answer of an approximately correct. So all of that to say, again, math students, who do you want to blame for this? The ancient Sumerians. They understood geometry, they understood how to use it, how to develop it, and go through all of those different things there. So we see that going through. Now, this pyramid here was most likely built before Abraham by a man named Dusur, the pharaoh Dusur going through. And some Egyptologists believe that the stair-stepping there was used as so that the deceased pharaoh could ascend into heaven. Now, quick sidestep with that. I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm not actually really technically a historian. I really enjoy history. But I think throughout time and throughout archaeological history, people try to put a lot of meaning on things that they find. For instance, this here, that it was a way for them, the deceased pharaoh, to go up into the heavens of the stair step. Or maybe it was really easy to build it that way, so that's how they built it, kind of thing. And there's times like this that they have. In Rome, and I'll show you a picture of this in 2 weeks, they kept finding these shapes, these obviously made items, either mostly of stone or metal, and it was kind of like a 3D octagon that had these little pegs sticking out of it. And they found them, and so they found several of them, and couldn't figure out what they were for. And so the archaeologists were like, oh, well, that must be used some kind of device for some type of ritual or worshiping their gods or different things like that. And then eventually somebody came along whose mother was really into knitting. And what it was a shape that was used that you would be able to loop the yarn around in order to make a hat or a tube scarf. And so, whereas they were like, oh, this must be used for making, sacrifices to their gods. No, they used it to make hats, kind of thing. So here, that they were using it to stair step into heaven, maybe that eventually came into their mythology, but at the same time, it was really easy to build it that way. So that's how they built it. Instead of going through there. So as time went on, we know that Abraham eventually left Egypt, and then the fast forward a couple hundred years, and Joseph ends up in Egypt there. We see that time has developed. Who was the people group that sold, that were the slave traders that bought Joseph from his brothers and then sold him to Egypt? Say it again? Ishmaelites specifically, like people living in Canaan, they're the Ishmaelites. Well, they came from the people group of Ishmael. And so, according to tradition, after Ishmael was kicked out of Abraham's home with his mom Hagar, does anybody remember why he was kicked out? Sarah didn't like him, but something happened. He did something specifically. When he was probably about 17 years old and Isaac was young, probably about 3 or 4. He mocked him. Ishmael was making fun of Isaac. Now, was this a much older brother teasing a younger brother? Probably not. For Sarah to react the way she did, just looking at there. But also, some people theorize that Sarah also wanted to make sure that Isaac did not lose any of his inheritance from Abraham. But there was a really interesting thing there when we look at that. Today, the Ishmaelites, or let me say it a little bit differently. Today, Arabs claim lineage from Ishmael, specifically people from the Arabian Peninsula. They claim descendants from him. And what's interesting is that, when you think Arab today, most often the religion that comes to mind is Muslims. And so the Muslims and the Israelites, the Arabs and the Israelites have always been in contention for, especially now with the war in Palestine, between Palestine and Israel is going on there. And so you look at that, and if you if you're not careful, you'll look and say, okay, Israel and the Arabs are at war today, so Abraham must have, really disliked Ishmael. The Bible doesn't indicate that. That it's actually when Abraham was confronted by Sarah at that point and says, you need to kick him out, like disown him, send him away, Abraham didn't want to do it. In Genesis, it says that he felt bad about it, but God actually reassured Abraham and said, don't worry, he is going to be blessed. He is going to have many children. He's going to have massive offspring, just like Isaac will. He won't have the land like Isaac will, but he still will be blessed. God said to Abraham, I am going to take care of him. And he did. And today we see the results of that with the population growth there in the Middle East. And so the Ishmaelites were going through and they bought Joseph there and then sold him into slavery in Egypt. Now, a couple of things with that. Again, we're looking at this and, the putting and understanding history and the Bible, then also our modern understanding. I don't think this is something that, as a whole, we would need to really delve into, but slavery was something that was completely common in their culture. So common that they were okay to sell their half-brother into it. Now, granted, their first choice was to kill him, and instead they were like, let's make some money off of him, kind of thing. So we're not giving them any credit for selling him into slavery. But it was very common to do that. And so when Joseph went there and got the job at Potiphar's house, he was there. Eventually, we know that he ran into trouble with Potiphar's wife. Quick little side note, what did Potiphar do? What was his job in the Bible? What he was captain of what? A captain of the guard, captain of the soldiers there. And so that either could be that he was kind of the captain of the personal bodyguard of Pharaoh, or may have just been like an idea, like a general, a head military leader. So Joseph was one step removed from Pharaoh when he was working for Potiphar. Well, the story goes that Potiphar's wife keeps making advances onto Joseph, and Joseph's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I can't do it. Stop. Leave me alone. Eventually, he rejects her the last time, and she's done with it. She's like, fine, if you're not going to fall to my advances, I'm going to lie about you, say that you laid with me, and then I'll just, I'll deal with it. One thing that's interesting, and again, this is the Stuart Rogers commentary of the Bible. This is extra biblical here, that Pharaoh's let's look the captain of the guard, that Pharaoh's the ruler of his bodyguard there, that guy is in charge. Like, he is able to make decisions about people's lives, especially his own slaves. So I find it incredibly interesting that Potiphar, who had some kind of military rulership, some type of leadership there, and had his own slave's life in his hand, that when his wife, Potiphar's wife, accused this slave of raping her, that he's like, well, I'm not going to kill him. That he puts him in jail. Now, today, our understanding, that's what happens to most criminals, that they go to jail for that. Back then, if you could think about it, if I had the power to execute somebody who the word came that he did that to my wife, I would kill him. So why didn't he kill him? We don't know, but my theory is that he did not believe his wife. That he knew she was that kind of a woman, and he knew what kind of man Joseph was, and knew that he would not have done that to her. But also, as a husband, I understand he had to do something with Joseph. All right? Happy wife, happy life. Nothing rhymes with happy husband. All right? Just saying. And so he knew he had to do something. So he couldn't keep Joseph in the household, obviously, so he throws him in jail and basically forgets about him. So we know that the story continues, eventually gets into place with Pharaoh, and is put in charge. The second in command is what the Bible often says. He was the vizier. So what vizier did Joseph serve with? Two different possibilities. Well, really one possibility, but he's also often given two different names, is a guy named Sesostris I, who appointed Joseph as the vizier there, or prime minister. Now, this man was a really good pharaoh for while he was going through there, while he was doing things. He had been fighting the kingdom that was to the south of Egypt, while his father was fighting in Libya, and his father was the head pharaoh at that time, and he was kind of co-regent, and the father was assassinated while on campaign. And so that meant that Siseratus I had to return back to Egypt, solidify his reign, and was going through there and doing that, and going through with what was taking place there. We actually have a recording about Siseratus I, and I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. Just be aware of that. And the statement in this particular scroll says, Siseratus is known to have had a vizier or prime minister by the name of Menhotep, who wielded extraordinary power, and some scholars have identified this vizier with the biblical Joseph, that they believe he was going through there and doing that. And so, incredible opportunity that he had there. So, moving forward to Moses. This is the one that I was looking at there and dealing with. So Abraham was the one that dealt with some different things and the multiple different kings or pharaohs that he met. But real quick, I want to talk about the pyramids for just a little bit more, then we'll get into Moses. So this is most commonly the picture that people see and think about when you think of the pyramids there. They're out there, way in the desert kind of thing. How many people have been to Giza in here and seen the pyramids? I have not. It's on my bucket list, but my wife doesn't want me to go, so happy wife, happy life. Anyway, so you have the pyramids there, and from this image, it looks like they're out in the wilderness, out there in the desert and everything. But I found this picture really cool. All that right there, that's Cairo. So this picture is just really good marketing. And that's what it actually looks like. Has anybody ever been to the Alamo in Texas? Same kind of thing. All right, you're expecting like the Davy Crockett, thing where it's out there, you got tumbleweed blowing around. No, it's like right in the middle of San Antonio, Texas. On one side, you have a Bubba Gump's, and on the other side, you have a Ripley's Believe It or Not Wax Museum. I was really disappointed when I saw that. I wanted to see tumbleweed when I was at the Alamo, but it wasn't there. So don't be expecting to see, a bunch of wilderness and everything if you ever get a chance to go see the pyramids, because right there's Cairo. But with that, turn in your Bibles to Revelation chapter 19, please. Revelation 19. This is where we'll probably finish out for this morning. And I remember, it's several months ago now, Pastor Wright was doing a study on Revelation and on Christ, and he got to this verse here, and it was something that sounds a little odd. So, this is talking about Jesus here. If we look at verse 11 of Revelation chapter 19. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he, meaning Jesus, that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. His eyes were as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns, and he held a name written that no man knew but he himself. So when we picture and think about crowns, what we think of is, the royal crown of England or something like that, and it just sits on top of the head. It's may have some felt or velvet in there. It looks real good. And so when we think about that, the crown, and then we picture this here, that on his heads are many crowns. Now, one thing that you have to do with the Bible is that as a conservative Christian, you should be trying to look at the Bible as literal as possible, as often as possible. You never want to get into the danger of looking at it saying, well, that's just figurative. Well, because when you get into doing that, well, that's just figurative, or that's just poetic justice or poetic license there. You run into the threat of saying, okay, well, all of it could be figurative. All of it could be poetic. So looking at this verse in Revelation 19:12, you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, on his head are many crowns. Well, if you're trying to do that as literal as possible, the problem is if you think of the Queen or King of England with multiple of their crowns stacking off, that one is, not real sturdy, and two, kind of goofy looking to think about. So I've not heard it specifically for this verse, but I could understand where somebody said, well, that's just figurative. That means that he owns many crowns, that he has several places that he's in charge of, that he has sovereignty over those places, which may be part of it. But one of the reasons I love history, and one of the reasons I also hopefully this course will help you guys have a better understanding of ancient history, is because when you understand the ancient history and the ancient cultures and ancient society, things in the Bible make more sense. Behind me, and I've got about 2 or 3 minutes now, behind me is a picture of what looks like several different, fashion statements that this man is wearing here. But as I mentioned earlier, at the very beginning, Egypt, for a lot of the time before Abraham, was separated into two different nations, two different countries would be an easy way, kingdoms would be an easy way to look at it, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Well, this picture here behind me, the white crown, the one on the far left, that was the crown that the king of northern Egypt, the upper kingdom, wore. The one in the middle, the red crown, was the crown that the southern king wore. Well, when the pharaohs united the kingdoms, they combined the crowns and made one type of crown there. And so that guy on the far right is wearing several crowns. He's wearing multiple crowns. And so this tiny little understanding here of what's going on helps us figure out some things here. Because we look at that verse there in Revelation 19:12, it's not the idea of where like the Queen of England or the King of England, where you have multiple crowns stacked on top of each other, kind of teetering off to the side. And it may be that it's, meaning that he owns several crowns, that he is sovereign over several different areas, which is a very viable possibility. But this is also a possibility here, that as Christ, as conqueror and ruler of the world, and the different areas and regions that he has there, each place, and here again, you could even moved it over. You can understand this, that as he was going through and conquering, those crowns, that symbol of his leadership, the symbol of his ruling power, were all added together and created what we often see today in hieroglyphics and things like that, of a united Egyptian kingdom that is there. And so, leave you with this, that understanding biblical history is so much easier when you have an understanding and appreciation for ancient history. Because you're able to look at the Bible and say, we were able to look at it and take it much more realistically, instead of trying to look at it and saying, well, things are figurative. And here is one of those evidences that a little basic understanding of ancient Egyptian ruling and pharaohs, and I guess you could say fashion to a certain extent, helps us understand that verse in Revelation 19, where most likely it's not several crowns stacked on top of each other, but individual crowns combined to show that he now rules all of those areas. All right, tomorrow, and by tomorrow I mean Sunday, next Sunday, we'll deal with the Exodus. I've got several things I wanted to get through today, but wasn't able to. Deal with the Exodus, and then be able to go into Israel being developed into a nation. I'll have a couple of videos to show you that kind of shows the difference even today in how different people groups view portions of the Bible that are there. So let's pray, and then we'll be dismissed. Dear Father, once again, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you that you have given us the ability to study and learn it. I ask that you would help us to just remember these things, Lord, that even though a lot of this is from outside the Bible, that knowing those things of the culture and the societies of the time help us to better appreciate and understand who you are and what was going on when your word was written. I ask that you'd be with us today, help the service to be a blessing to our lives. In your Son's name,